So the last thing we need to do for the wet map is understand that, it's all shiny down here now, which is right, but we don't want it to see it this shiny underneath the water. When we're looking through the water, I don't want to see reflection, bright lights coming up from the bottom. That doesn't make sense. This is only shiny because this is the water. It's representing a thin film of water. When you're underwater, think about footage you might have seen from underwater, things are actually quite diffuse. They tend not to be very shiny because, again, they don't have a film of reflective water on them already. You're in it. So pretty easy to accommodate that. What we need to do is have two render grounds. One for the outside, which will use the wet mapped shader, and one for the inside, which will use the regular shader, which is why we made two of them. So coming back out here, this is using the external one. This one needs to use the internal one. The internal one does not have all those changes we just made. It's still fairly rough. We might make it actually a little bit darker, I will say. But let's just turn all that stuff back on and see what that looks like. You might be wondering, though, as I am, how's this going to work? We're just literally rendering two grounds. Outside, we're going to be rendering the ground on top of the ground. How is it going to know to use the wet map for the ones on the outside? Well, when we're rendering, we have an idea of, there we go. When the rays leave the camera, the first thing they hit, so traveling from the camera into the scene, the first thing they hit, these are the primary rays. So when they see the ground outside of the water, that's all primary rays. When we see the ground through the water, though, like, here, those are secondary rays. The first primary rays hit the water, and then new rays, refraction rays, were sent into the water. Some rays were sent outwards, reflection rays. In any case, those are both secondary rays. So there is a difference. The difference is that the stuff we see through it are considered secondary rays. So that's important because we can say only ever render the ground on the outside if you are a primary ray. So choosing visible only to primary rays puts the word primary there. And we can do the opposite here, where we are invisible to primary rays, but are visible to everything else. What you can see is just minus primary. So together, we are still rendering the ground always, just with two different shaders. So the external one, again, will get the wet mapping, and the internal one will not. So let's see what that looks like. Get out of here. So I hope that makes sense, the idea of primary and secondary rays. If you like, you can try to just render the whole thing with one and see how you'd see the shininess and whatnot. Oh, I didn't have it open over here. But there you go. We can see here the wet mapping on the side compared to, let's say, here to here, or here to here. Like so. So that's what I mean. It integrates it into the side. There's now a transitional area between the water and the dry ground. And you'll see that presumably everywhere. Nice and shiny. You may need to tweak it. You may need to tweak it in terms of the colors. Like maybe it should be darker. Maybe the internal should be darker. Maybe the wet mapped color should be darker. Hard to say without actually running through it. The darker we make the internal ground, though, the harder it will be to see stuff that is under the water, I mean. So if you have an area that's right up against it like this, we can see it actually looks like it's darker. The wet mapped area out here is darker than what's in here. So I would say in that case, perhaps the internal should be darker. So I'm going to say snapshot that. I'm going to shift, click, and hold on this area here. And let's bring the brightness down on the internal. I mean, that makes sense when we think about it, because we just said that the wet map color is much darker at 0.15, but the internal is still fairly bright. So it looks like we need to maybe even step down a little bit more on the internal here. I don't want to go too dark though, because again, I still want to see into the water. But I'd be curious what this looks like now too. So yeah, so now we actually see the darkness on the object itself. So does that make sense? We made the internal, meaning the ground that we see through the water, darker now to match. So everything got darker. But we still see into the river anyway. A little bit harder, but that's okay. If we wanted to compensate for that, you might be interested in turning down the uniform volume. Maybe bring it down to 3 on the density there. Let's see. I'm going to let this render out a little bit more. And then, you know what? I won't even. Let's snapshot this too. And let's see what a cloud density of 3 on the uniform. As you can see, there's that error again. So you have to click render again to actually have it use the proper color. So strange. And let's see what that looks like. So it's rendering that now, and I seem to have gotten my mouse stuck on this noodle here. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so it's a slightly lighter now that we've brought the cloud density down a little bit here. We can see into the water a little bit easier. You know, this is all fairly arbitrary, but the point is you can endlessly tweak this stuff. There we go. This is a better way. You can see how the whole thing is a little bit lighter now. Not sure if I like that. I think I maybe have liked it when it was darker. But I do like seeing the rocks under the ground. See how much harder it is to see like the rocks like that now that we made it darker? Oh well. It's more accurate. You know, when it wasn't so dark, this looked weird. So now it looks more, again, integrated. So we've done it. We've done the wet maps. We generated the data and modified the shaders pretty easily, I hope. Hopefully you can use that as a jumping off point to modify the shaders in other cool ways too. There's lots of interesting ways you can drive shaders with simulations and such. But this is how we're going to do it in this lesson. So only one more thing to do, which is the sprays, and then we're pretty much done. We're at least done with this resolution, and then trying to tackle the higher resolution is a whole other thing.